She kicked me out the day after my son's funeral, and she had the nerve to call it closure. But what she didn't know was that my son had already planned for me in ways she couldn't see. If you're new here, welcome. Before I go any further, subscribe and tell me where you're watching from. It helps to know who sits with me in these stories. My name is Eleanor Fairfield. I was born in a small house with a creaky back porch and a hydrangea bush my mother planted the summer I turned 10. I know the smell of coffee before the kettle even boils. I know how a picture frame tilts when a shelf settles into the wall. Those ordinary things, the little noises and the familiar grooves in well-worn wood, are what steady you after a shock. After David died, I clung to those small certainties like a child clutches a blanket. David was my only child. He was careful the way some people are careful with glass. Gentle hands, precise measures, a quiet voice that seemed to say, "Don't worry, I've got it." He married Stephanie 5 years before that, and at first she felt like an addition to the family, someone who laughed at the right times and brought a new kind of order into our Sunday dinners. If you had asked me then, I would have told you I trusted them both the way a mother trusts the people who come into her son's life. When David and Stephanie decided to buy the house on Maple Street, they asked me to help. I sold the little place where I kept my pans and my mother's recipe cards, the one with the hydrangea, and I gave them $40,000 for the down payment, because that was what David asked for, quietly, between the groceries and the garden shears he brought for my birthday. He promised it was temporary. "Mom," he said, "just until we get on our feet." He put his arm around my shoulder the way he always did when he wanted to reassure me, and I believed him. I moved in because my legs were getting stiff, because the house had 3 steps I could no longer be sure about in icy weather, because it felt better to be near David. For a while it was exactly as they promised. Dinners shared, bills divided, my chair by the window, where I could see the street and the mailman, who incidentally never waved back. David attended to the small things, the things you only notice if they're not handled. The filter on the furnace, the leak under the sink, the call to the dentist when my appointment was missed. He would frown at the list of things and say, "Leave it to me." And then 10 minutes later, over tea, he would have the problem solved. But people are like houses. You notice the settling only when a crack appears along the molding. It started with small rearrangements, a photograph replaced, a recipe card moved to a drawer, a little jar of stamped envelopes cleared from the kitchen counter and put away in a cupboard that wasn't my habit to open. At first I thought I was being forgetful. Then I started to notice patterns. Stephanie began to answer questions for me in a tone like she was tidying up a subject. When I would ask David about something, "Do you want the blue bowl back?" he'd look at Stephanie, then at me, and smile that slight smile that said he didn't want the trouble of arguing. There were nights I would wake and find that photos where I had been in the background now had a different frame around them. Faces that included me were subtly cropped. When I asked, "Oh, did you move these?" the answer was always the same, polite and final. "We were just making room, Mom. You know how small the cabinets are." It was little things rubbed together until they make a sound loud enough for you to hear. David was not the kind of man who raised his voice. If he saw friction, he tried to smooth it. That was his way. He was the bridge between us and the polite distances people kept. He'd stand in the middle, arms out like a small, careful arbor, and say, "We'll figure it out." I thought that bridge would hold forever. On a Tuesday night in late October, I got a call that made my hands forget how to hold a cup. It doesn't matter if you've been a mother for 60 years. Nothing prepares you for the way the world tilts when you hear your child's name followed by hospital and come quickly. The drive felt like the kind you make when sleep has been taken from you. Motor sounds magnified, each red light an interrogation. I don't remember the paramedics' faces. I do remember the hospital corridor being too bright, the linoleum too white, and a smell that was a mixture of antiseptic and roses someone had brought for a bedside. They told me he died quietly, they said. The words came out clinical and thin. Someone wrapped my wrists with a blanket. A nurse sat with me and said the civil things nurses say. I held onto a pillowcase because my hands needed a thing to do. In the waiting room, Stephanie stood with a stack of papers and a face that had more composure than I could imagine. The composure felt like a costume. When she smiled, it landed wrong. When she spoke to the funeral director, she did so as though she was signing a contract rather than mourning a husband. There was grief there, but it was measured and neat, the kind you see on television for characters, not the raw, unbuttoned kind that makes your knees give way. The funeral itself was a blur of hymns and muted embraces. The choir sang softly. Lilies took up too much of the front of the church. People came with casseroles and glass bowls and "We're so sorries," and the air smelled of perfume and incense and the dampness from the rain that had started outside. I sat in the third pew, clutching a program as if it were a map I could follow. Stephanie organized seating as though arranging a dinner table. She told me who should sit next to whom and where the cousins would stand. She accepted condolences with the practiced patience of someone who had been rehearsing a part. After the reception, she took charge of the arrangements and the house. She told me, in a softened voice that pretended to be considerate, that she needed space to grieve with her sister-in-law and the other family. "It just won't be the same with you here," she said. If I had been less stunned, I probably would have laughed at the idea that a widow who had been married less than a handful of years could be more entitled to a house than the woman who had lived there for a decade. The dictionary of loss doesn't always respect chronology. She gave me a deadline that felt unreal. "Mom," she said, "I need the house to sort things. Could you go for a few days? Just book a place, please. It will be easier for everyone." Her voice had that measured sympathy again. When I said I had nowhere to go, she gave options. A motel near the highway, a friend's spare room, like she was offering me extra napkins with a meal she didn't expect me to finish. For the first time in my life, I was thrown out the way you throw out a coat you don't intend to wear anymore. Someone who had taken part in the family for years could, in one polite move, make me feel as if I were a guest who had overstayed. 1,000 little indignities gathered into a big one. I packed my things in paper bags, the ones they sell in the supermarket, because boxes would have taken longer, and men in suits looked away when I passed them in the street. David's favorite chair, the one with a coffee stain on the left arm where he always rested his cup, was left behind. Somewhere in the kitchen, the jar of my mother's buttons lay undisturbed. I could not bring myself to carry it. The 24-hour notice wasn't given with malice exactly. It was given with the calm efficiency of someone cleaning a slate. Stephanie helped me fold my sweaters and told me, with what she must have thought was kindness, that this would be better for both of us. We didn't argue. What happens after a funeral is never the moment for an argument. The world is already raw enough. People speak in soft tones, as if the awkwardness will not otherwise be noticed. I checked into a motel off the interstate because that is where the modest rooms are. The bedspread was a polyester pattern that had tried to be floral. The lamp had a pull chain that clicked. I lay awake, listening to the hum of the highway and the tape of my brain. Memory, memory, memory. And it felt obscene to sleep in a place that had no photographs of my family on the walls. The pillow smelled faintly of smoke. I kept reaching out in the dark for the sound of his television, that small domestic noise you don't realize you miss until it's gone. I am not unpractical. I was resourceful because I had to be. Those $40,000 had been my life savings poured into a hope. I had expected to rent a small apartment after a time, to have my own dishes and my own shelf in a kitchen again. Instead, I counted pennies between motel stays, stretched my savings, avoided the phones for fear of the call that would suggest the kind of help I did not want to ask for. There was an ache that wasn't only for David. It was for the normalness of being known and counted in a household. The days became a slow clock. Friends came to check on me, bearing casseroles and sauntering conversations that tried to close around the new emptiness. They would say softly, "If you need anything, dear," and I would smile and give a phrase like, "I'm all right," because there is dignity in not making others uncomfortable with the full sound of your sorrow. Meanwhile, the house on Maple Street existed in a private orbit, with Stephanie commanding and Marcus, Stephanie's brother, a quiet man who looked like someone who avoids the center of things, appearing for short visits and then disappearing again. One afternoon, about a week after the funeral, there was a call that felt like a coin dropped into a fountain. The conductor's clear, official voice of James Morrison, the lawyer. He said he needed to arrange a reading of the will. There are some sentences that feel like a gated entrance opening to a part of life you cannot step back from. The lawyer's voice told me to be present on a certain day in his office. He gave no hint of what the will would say. No small sops to comfort. Flesh and paper, he reminded me. Paper is the place where intentions are translated into consequences. Going to James Morrison's office was like walking into a room where time had been measured precisely. His leather chair creaked when I sat, and he would clasp his hands in front of him with the sort of neatness that makes you feel as if there's a whole life behind each motion. He had read wills before. He had folded grief into formal language, and then folded that language into envelopes. With him were the people you expect at such a reading. Stephanie, in a black coat that looked too new for grief. Marcus, who kept his hands in his pockets. A few others who had the look of relatives marshaled for a ceremony. The will itself is a strange kind of last voice. It can be generous, parsimonious, angry, or cautious. Ours began with the boilerplate, funeral expenses, the settling of debts, the small formalities. There was talk of the house, and how it would pass to Stephanie. I had expected that. Who inherits the house is the sort of thing that gets said plainly, almost as if the building itself is an object to be moved like a chair. The name of my son came with a small, practical sentence that placed property in a new set of hands. I felt a small hollowness, the employment of property as an emotional geography. Then after the standard clauses, there was a moment. It wasn't a flourish, not the sort of dramatics you see in movies. It was quiet and surprisingly tender in its simplicity. James Morrison adjusted his glasses and read a short paragraph that for no obvious reason seemed to brighten the air. In addition, he read, "I bequeath the contents of my safety deposit box at Maple Street Bank to my mother, Eleanor Fairfield." The room exhaled in small, involuntary ways. I had not expected anything, and sometimes not expecting is the most honest posture you can have. James continued, turning pages with the respect due to someone who has written themselves out of the room. He handed me a sealed envelope after the reading, the kind that contains more than paper. Inside were a bank letter, a small key, and instructions to the bank manager. He explained quietly that the bank would accept the letter as authorization to open the box for me, and that the box's number was printed on the paperwork. He didn't say more than the facts. He didn't need to. The fact that there was a key sitting in my palm felt like a physical piece of a promise, finally made manifest. For a week before that, I had been constructing small, private arguments in my head. If the will didn't say anything for me, I thought, what would I do? My imagination supplied various endings. A charity plate, a family fight, a generous closing. The will's clarity felt like a hand in mine pulling me back from the edge of uncertainty. It read like a map David had left for me, the kind of care he had always kept tucked in his wallet. Extra insurance, a folded list of numbers, a note that said, "Call me back when you can," in his tiny shorthand. Once the will reading was over, Stephanie left the room with Marcus at her heels, their faces controlled. She murmured something about arranging the house and the estate, and everyone else shuffled away with the kind of mechanical courtesy people adopt when there is more to be done than words can hold. I left the office with the envelope hidden in the pocket of my coat, as if my son had given me something to wear against the cold. Going to the bank felt different from going to the lawyer. At the lawyer's office, paper had been the voice. At the bank, the voice would be inventory, boxes, locks, and a metal drawer that answers to a key. The Maple Street Bank had old marble steps and a bank manager, Mrs. Peterson, whose smile was practical and whose hands had the steady habit of someone who had been balancing ledgers for longer than she'd care to admit. She ushered me into a small, quiet room with a drawer and a chair that fit neatly under a small counter. The fluorescent lights above the counter hummed like a distant highway. "Miss Fairfield," she said, reading from the lawyer's letter. "We're obliged to follow his instructions." We both sat there for a minute, a woman with a key and a bank manager with a procedure manual. It was the strangest kind of intimacy, two people at a table ready to unwrap a life. I thought of David's hands on the steering wheel of his car, of the way he arranged pens in his briefcase, of the way he never lost a receipt, the small habits of someone who plans. She retrieved a heavy metal key from a box and slid it across the counter. The metal felt colder than I expected. There was a quiet between us, a soft embarrassment for how ordinary it all looked. A key, a number scratched inside a ledger, a locked space that had once been private. She asked for my identification, and my hands shook a little when I handed over my driver's license. I could hear them. The numbing part of grief doesn't always come in waves. Sometimes it is a plain, steady thing. Other times it arrives as flashes, a handshake that contains a memory, the sound of a song at a funeral that acts as an incision and shows you what else lies beneath. As Mrs. Peterson led me to the vault, I rehearsed what the box might hold. Perhaps some small keepsakes, she thought. Perhaps letters, perhaps a photograph. My mind ran through the things a man might choose to secure. Jewelry, a document, a photograph of a private moment. The vault door felt like a mouth opening. She slid the key into a slot and turned. There was a sound of compliance, a metal sigh, and then a metallic clack as rows of boxes sealed behind a grill came into view. We took an elevator down into a corridor that was cooler than the bank above, the air smelling faintly of metal and something like paper left in a drawer. She found the row and the small numbered box that matched the ledger. "Open when you're ready," Mrs. Peterson said, handing me a long-handled key that belonged to the drawer itself. There was a practiced privacy in the way she stepped back, a space she created that said she would not intrude into whatever this box contained. I remember the key as if it were an instrument of prophecy. It felt ordinary, almost comical compared to the gravity of what it might unlock. When I slid the key into the box and turned it, the drawer came forward with a small whir. The metal edges were cool under my fingers. I did not open it immediately. My hand hovered for a second, because there are moments that require you to take a breath like you are crossing a threshold. I had been through enough procedural steps that day to know how the world makes itself into a series of smaller doors. I knew the box contained something my son had chosen to keep private, and perhaps that was why my hand paused. The awareness that what I was about to see had been selected carefully, like a list of instructions written in invisible ink. When you lose someone, you imagine the letters they might have tucked away. You imagine explanations, confessions, little pieces of themselves folded tight. I had thought of scenarios in which the box would be empty, as if his careful life had been unraveled entirely by the same silence that now filled my days. But there was also the quiet stubbornness of a son who always thought 2 steps ahead. If there was anything that could be counted on after the uncountable happened, it was David's planning. I took a breath and slid the drawer the rest of the way out. What I found, the way paper creased, the heft of an envelope, a narrow booklet of statements stacked in tidy order, is something I will tell you about next. For now, I sat in the little vault room with the drawer open and a key in my hand, listening to the hum of the world beyond the metal door, and feeling for the first time since that rainy Tuesday as if someone had, in the most practical way he knew how, set a small lamp in the hallway for me to follow. Please share in the comments if you've ever felt unexpectedly protected by something someone left behind. I'd like to know I'm not alone. The drawer slid open with a small metallic sigh, and for a moment I only looked at the neat stack of papers, as if they were not paper at all, but the measured breaths of the sun I had just lost. There was an envelope on top, his handwriting across the front, the way he'd always addressed letters. Firm, precise, as if he were jotting a note to himself that would later be useful. Beneath the envelope were bank statements folded into a narrow booklet, each one stamped with tidy dates and numbers, and a small packet held together with a paperclip. The packet had no flourish. It was workmanlike, the way David did everything. I opened the envelope first. The page inside was a single sheet, folded in half, written in his hand. I read it once without breathing, then read it aloud to Mrs. Peterson, because the room felt too small to hold the silence otherwise. "Mom," it began. He had written that simple word with the casual affection he'd used in texts and grocery lists. "If you're reading this, then I've done what I could to keep you safe. There were no grand pronouncements. There was no dramatic confession. There was instead the small particular care of a man who had lived in the registry of receipts and reminders. He thanked me for selling the house, for trusting him with that $40,000, for coming to live near him when my knees grew uncertain. He told me he'd placed some of that money into investments he thought cautious, the sort that grow slowly and steadily. He told me, too, to forgive him for his practicalness. He assumed I would. I didn't tell Stephanie everything he had written, and even in his handwriting that sentence surprised me. Not because I didn't trust her, but because some things I wanted to keep simple. If anything happens, there will be papers that explain. If anything happens, the bank box is for you. He wrote about small things that had the power to break my heart all over again. The smell of coffee in the morning, the way I liked my toast, the chair by the window. He wrote in a line that made me fumble for a tissue. "You taught me to notice the little things. This is me noticing back." I folded the letter back along the crease and held it like an amulet. Mrs. Peterson sat opposite me with her hands folded on the table, as if she were reading the margins of my life. She had been gentle from the start. There was no rush in her. The bank exists to tally, but there are people within it who understand the heft of a human moment. The statements beneath the letter were, well, I don't pretend that numbers become poetry when read aloud, but these numbers were not abstract. They were the slow, sure accumulation of someone who had chosen to convert a down payment into a nest egg. Account titles, dates, and balances stitched together into a pattern. The last page of the booklet held a notation that made my vision swim and my heart stutter in good ways. Total balance, listed in a neat column, $185,000. $185,000. I read it twice, then a third time, because the mind likes to check whether the world is playing a trick. David had not simply tucked away a few keepsakes. He had taken what I had given him, placed it where compound interest and cautious investments could do their quiet, faithful work, and left it there for me. After the initial shock of the number came something else. The packet of printed materials. The packet contained the kinds of things you print when you are trying to make a point that words alone cannot hold. Emails with dates and times, text message threads printed as they appear on a phone screen, and several pages that looked like credit card statements with transactions itemized. They were ordered as if someone had in mind a sequence. First the conversations, then the receipts, then the inference. There were texts between Stephanie and a number labeled Marcus in my mind by now as her brother. At first glance, they looked like ordinary exchanges, arrangements for dinner, talk about which relatives would come for a holiday. But as I read down the thread, I could see the same pattern I'd seen in the house. A soft, managerial voice guiding choices, nudging actions. There were messages discussing clearing the house and getting things in order with a tone that assumed authority. One message, dated a month before David's death, read like an inventory. We need to start deciding what stays. It will be easier if we make a plan. No offense, Mom, but the extra boxes don't help. Another, briefer line carried the kind of casual cruelty that becomes sharp when you know the outcome. If he ever wants to leave things for his mother, we'll figure out how to handle it later. I remember feeling the air go out of me in a small, precise way. These were not accusations with exclamation marks. They were a record, the quiet scaffolding of decisions. The credit card receipts showed purchases that, to be honest, made my stomach tighten. Higher-end wardrobes, a piece of jewelry from a downtown boutique, a few weekend trips with hotel addresses that matched entries on the texts. None of these things are crimes. They were, however, evidence of priorities. They showed an appetite for a lifestyle that would not be satisfied by a small inheritance or by living modestly. There were also emails, short notes with times and attachments, between an email address that matched Stephanie's and an account used for arranging probate matters. Some notes were practical and mundane, but others contained the kind of language that, when you placed it beside the texts, looked like a plan. It will be less messy if we remove lingering items quickly, one read. We can allocate sentimental things later. The tone of those sentences was calm, administrative, and beneath the administrative tone pulsed an assumption that we meant those who would make the decisions, not me. I could have left at that moment and folded the packet back into its paperclip cocoon, and perhaps never used it for anything but the warm comfort of knowing my son had thought to protect me. I could have gone back to the motel and let the evidence sit like a secret lamp under my coat. But to do that would have been to step back into the place of powerless spectatorship, and David had not raised me to sit quietly while others rearranged the furniture of my life. Mrs. Peterson watched me as I adjusted the papers under my hands. "We will take a copy of these for our records if you'd like," she said. She was careful to sound unintrusive. I accepted with a quiet yes and signed the bank form she slid across. The bank's role is inventory. Hers was to make sure the enumeration was correct, and somewhere in that act I felt the world shift a little. Balance, ledger, account, the practical things that keep life from being only grief. I did not seek revenge. I wanted something quieter, to be known, to be safe, to be able to feed myself without someone's beneficence disguised as management. I wanted the dignity of being the person to decide my chair and my shelves. Back at the motel that evening, I read the letter again and then turned the pages of the bank statements, like someone reading an atlas. On a small sticky note that I folded into the packet, I wrote a name and a time. Stephanie, lunch Saturday, 1 p.m. It was not bravado. It was an invitation I planned to accept. It arrived as invitations often do, by text. Her message was casual and even a little tentative. "Mom, can we talk? Maybe have lunch. There are some things to discuss about the house. Would Saturday work?" I could have declined. I could have let that be the polite end of the story. Instead, I wrote back, short and to the point, "Yes, 1 p.m. bring whatever you like." When Saturday arrived, I dressed in the sweater David had always liked on me, the blue one that made him grin, the one with the slightly worn elbow. It felt like armor of a gentler kind. I did my hair simply, put on a brooch my mother had given me because some mornings you hold a family to your chest like a talisman. I left the packet in my bag, folded and neat. I was not going for blood. I was going for clarity. The house smelled like lemon oil, and something that could have been lilies, or could have been an attempt at them. Stephanie opened the door with a smile that looked too practiced to be entirely sincere. Marcus hovered just behind her, hands shoved into his pockets as if the gesture could make him smaller. The living room was rearranged in ways my eyes knew were deliberate. Photographs with different frames, My chair moved to a corner where the light was poor, little hints that suggested a new order of belonging. "Thank you for coming," Stephanie said, in a tone that tried for warmth. It's been a lot." We sat at the dining table, because that is where people sit when conversation is meant to be civil. She ordered tea, and then a course of modest sandwiches arrived with napkins and a small lemon tart. I ate slowly because I wanted to taste each moment precisely. The house hummed with ordinary noises, the dishwasher's thin humming, a clock on the wall, the faint shuffle of a neighbor in the yard. Ordinary sounds like that make confrontations less theatrical and more devastating in their ordinariness. "Mom," she said, stirring her tea, "I know this has been hard. I wanted to talk about how we handle things going forward. I want to make sure you're taken care of." She paused, as if the sentence would finish itself into generosity. I watched her hands. She had the habit of touching her thumb to the side of her index finger when she was thinking, something I'd noticed at the funeral and had thought then it was nerves. "Stephanie," I said, "I read David's letter. I opened his bank box." The words landed between us like a plate set down on the table. For a second she looked as if someone had told her the time of a train she had not expected. Then she smiled, a brittle thing. "Oh," she said. "Well, yes. I suppose that makes sense." I didn't make a speech. Instead, I slid the packet across the table like a small bridge. It made a sound as it hit the wood, a soft, definite thud. The paper lay there, ordinary as a menu, and then not ordinary at all. "These were in the box," I said. "He left me a letter. He left me an account. He left me some printouts." Her smile tightened. "Eleanor," she said, in a voice that tried to sound conciliatory, "all of that it's all part of the estate. We can go over it with James. There's no need to—" "No," I said. And there was a firmness in my own voice that surprised me. "I brought copies." She blinked. Marcus looked away, and then shut his eyes for a moment as if to clear them. "You shouldn't have—" "I should have what?" I asked. "Opened an envelope he chose to leave for me. Read the paper that bears his name. I didn't take anything that wasn't already his to give." She reached for the packet as if to pull it away, a reflexive move of a woman used to repositioning objects to suit her narrative, but I set my hand over hers and gently but firmly closed her fingers around the paper. She withdrew, startled. I laid out the things in order. First the letter, because it mattered that the voice came first. I read a few lines aloud, not theatrically, but as if reading a recipe, a list of instructions that had always seemed to me the truest form of love. I read the line where he thanked me for selling my house and wrote about using the money in investments. I read the line where he said plainly, "If anything happens, there will be documents. They are for you." Then I placed the account statement on the table and slid it toward them. $185,000, I said. Grown from what I gave him. He left it for me. Stephanie's face changed colors the way a sky does before a storm. She said, "You can't just—" But the sentence dissolved. Marcus stood abruptly, his chair scraping back. "Eleanor," he said, "we need the lawyer to—" "The lawyer is James Morrison," I reminded him. "We just heard him read the will." "You can't just make claims," Marcus began. "I'm not making claims," I said. "I'm showing you what is already in paper, arranged by him. These are his choices." I was not shouting, I was not gloating. There were moments when people expect fury. I had something that felt more dangerous to someone who thrives on control. Quiet, simple truths. I laid out the printed texts next. I had redacted nothing. The messages were as they had appeared in the banking packet. Dates, sender names, timestamps. I pointed to a message from 2 months earlier in which plans were discussed to clear the house and start fresh. I didn't invent sinister intent where none existed, but I did not give a polite gloss to a pattern that had already displaced me. Stephanie's response was the first thing I've ever seen that resembled the defense of a person who has only just realized she has been observed. At first, she attempted to dismiss, as she'd done before. "You know how stressful these things are, and we were only trying to help." She spoke of practicalities, the size of the house, the difficulty of managing it alone, the need for order after loss. She said it with the practiced softness of someone who had been answering staff emails all her life. "Those are convenient words," I said, "but David wrote that box for me." "People change," she said. "We all do what we must." "People show us who they are by what they keep and what they throw away," I said, not unkindly, but with a clarity that made the air tighten. "He kept these for me. He planned so I wouldn't have to ask." Marcus sat down heavily. He ran his fingers across his face, embarrassed, as if the papers had touched him personally. "It wasn't like that," he said at last. "Stephanie was just... she wanted to make sure things were handled properly." "Handled properly for whom?" I asked. Her eyes narrowed. There was a moment where I saw across the table not merely a daughter-in-law but a woman confronted by the moral consequence of choices she had been making with a managerial limp. She could have softened. She could have said simply, "You're right," and we could have clasped hands and found a way through. Instead, she made a decision. She would try to reframe the narrative, to place herself again at the center of a story in which she was the natural steward. "You'll make something out of nothing," she snapped. Then, the edge in her voice revealing how little reserve she had for anyone who refused to be grateful. "You think money absolves everything?" "I think my son's writing is clear," I said. "I think what he gave me is his choice. I think you have every right to grieve, but you don't have the right to erase me." The words weren't meant to punish her. They were meant to make a fact visible in a way she could no longer neatify. There was an instant where she looked like a woman who had expected me to fold into the background, because that was the usual choreography of families, an arrangement in which the elder blurs out while the new household draws the lines. She had miscalculated the presence of a will, a bank, and mostly a son who had thought in advance. "Look at this," I said, and I pushed a particular printout across the table. It was a text that read plainly, "We've got to make room. She'll be easier to manage if she has her own place." That language, manage, landed with a dull thud, perhaps the most revealing word of all. People can say manage about their own things. To say it about another person is to reveal a relationship built on control rather than care. Stephanie's face crumpled. It was not the theatrical collapse of someone playing martyr. It was the honest unraveling of someone who had been counted on to perform grief and now was discovered in the ledger of motives. She put her hands to her mouth and began to cry in a way that admitted both shame and alarm. Marcus stood and tried to murmur something like, "We didn't mean—" "Then tell me what you meant," I said softly. Her explanation came out as explanations do in fragments. She spoke of fear, of being young and alone with bills, of feeling overwhelmed by a house too big for one person. She spoke of practicalities, of wanting to protect the estate from being exhausted. She said things like, "I only wanted security for myself and for what I thought would be right for David's things." Her words were not untrue, in the sense that human motivations are often an interlaced knot of survival and self-interest. She believed some of what she said, and some she said to justify what she'd done. I thought of my son, who had always tried to keep his arms wide, who had known that families have their sharp edges and tried any way to build bridges. What he had done in that safety deposit box was to give me a different sort of bridge, not something to cross into another's mercy, but a way to stand on my own. When she began to plead, pleading is an unremarkable human thing, I listened. There was a moment when I could have delivered a name call or a fury that would satisfy a part of me that wanted the scales to tilt dramatically. But fury is quick. It solves nothing. David had not left me fury. He had left me paper and numbers and the kind of calm authority that comes from making a plan. "Stephanie," I said, placing my hand over hers. My voice was steady. "I'm not here to take turns at blaming. I am here to acknowledge the choices David made and the care he left for me. You grieve. So do I. But grief is not a currency that buys you permission to erase someone because you are overwhelmed." She made a sound that was half sob, half apology. Marcus folded his arms as if to keep himself from intervening. We sat, 3 people who had been cast into new roles by death, and the table between us became the site of a quiet accounting. "I don't want to humiliate you," I said. "I don't want to make this harder. I want what David wanted, for me to have some security." Stephanie mopped at her eyes with a napkin and looked at me as if seeing me anew. There was shame there, yes, but also the rawness of someone who had to decide how to live without the person who had been the center. Perhaps if I were less weary, I might have been kinder in that moment. But kindness does not require self-erasure. I wanted acknowledgement, not theatrical remorse. "What will you do?" she asked at last, voice small. "I will speak to James," I said. "I will make sure the paperwork is clear. I will accept what my son intended. I will—" I hesitated. I could have said press charges or contest or seek restitution, any of 1,000 things legal minds might suggest. But I wasn't interested in legal victories as a trophy. "I will secure a place where I can live with dignity," I finished. "I will not live under someone else's timetable." The rest of the lunch passed like a long exhale. We talked in smaller pieces about practicalities, how the house needed water checked, a gardener who came on Tuesdays, but the big thing had been settled by paper and by the quiet act of reading a man's letter and account. There was no high drama of lawyers slamming fists on tables. There was only the slow reorientation of 3 lives, each of us having to decide what we would be now that the center had been removed. Days following the lunch were not limelight moments. They were filled with forms and phone calls and the patient work of translating a balance into an address that would suit me. James Morrison handled the formalities with the same professional neatness he had shown in his office. Mrs. Peterson in the bank was a comfort in her command of procedure. I will not tell you that everything was quick or that people changed overnight. I will tell you the truth. The account existed, the letter existed, and between them there was a kind of moral authority that could not be bluffed away by performative grief. Stephanie continued to come and go to the house. Sometimes she would pass me on the porch and nod. Once she stood at a distance and watched me move a small box of my things from one car to another, as if seeing me was awkward, a reminder of a boundary she had helped draw. Marcus called twice to ask if there was anything he could do, and I accepted a single offer of help moving a heavy dresser. He did it with a quiet apology that needed no answer. There were nights, of course, when the memory of the funeral found me in small, cruel whispers. A hymn that began on the radio, a scent of antiseptic in a grocery store. Grief does not exit politely. It returns like a guest who has been promised a bed and then wakes in the night demanding tea. But amid the grief, there was a stabilization that came from not being anonymous in my own life. I could now decide whether to take walks in the park, whether to fix the broken step by myself or hire someone, whether to buy fresh lemon or buy store brand. Those choices felt less frivolous than they might sound. Dignity is often the accumulation of small freedoms. When people ask what I did with the money, they sometimes expect a tale of sudden extravagance. I did not buy a diamond necklace or a sedan. I rented a modest apartment with a little sunroom where plants could live and where my mother's recipe cards had a shelf. I hired someone to fix the banister so that my feet did not worry about balance. I made a modest deposit in a bank account that I could access without embarrassment, and left the rest in investments the way my son had intended, steady, cautious, a slow-growing comfort. I repaid some debts I had quietly accrued in the hotel months, and put a little aside so that family could visit without taking turns asking permission. More than the money, I carried with me a message David had written in that letter, that he had thought about me as a priority, that he had considered my vulnerability and acted on it. That is what steadied me in the weeks that followed. The assurance that my son hadn't left me thin-handed by oversight but by design, and that the design was to protect me. People in the neighborhood noticed the small changes. Mrs. Grimm from across the hall stopped by to bring a little jar of sugar and an apology for not having called sooner. The mailman, who had previously never waved, began to leave a small note of where he'd set packages. These were not acts of triumph. They were the everyday courtesies of a community rearranging itself around a woman who had been seen, not hidden. Stephanie and I reached a fragile truce that was mostly practical. There were no dramatic reconciliations. We spoke as neighbors with a joint history, and occasionally as people with mutual grief. She invited me once to a Sunday dinner months later. I declined with a polite, "not yet," and a frankness that it wasn't about anger but about time. Time heals and reveals in its slow manner. I had found my peace somewhere in the interval between her tears and my son's letter. I am not telling you this story to boast. I tell it because there is a particular kind of comfort in the fact that planning can be love. He had not merely left me numbers, he had left me the proof of his attention. The largest comfort is that his care was not performative or public. It was quiet, practical, and perfectly his. He chose a safety deposit box because he wanted certain things to be preserved, and in doing so, he left me with both money and testimony, a record of intent that gave me a chance to stand. I know some of you will hear this and think, this is too tidy. In life, things are messier. You are right. Wills do not erase grief. They do not magically soften the sharp edges of family conflict. There were lawyers and forms and moments of awkwardness. There were also apologies that came late and awkward silences that never fully smoothed. But paper has a stubbornness that human emotion sometimes lacks. It can make visible things people hoped to keep hidden. In the months that followed, I learned to walk without the expectation that someone would make space for me. I learned that safety can come in quiet calculators of compound interest, and that sometimes the best love is practical. I learned to let grief live its unruly life while letting dignity be the steady companion I chose in small acts. Cooking a meal I liked, putting a vase on a table, answering the phone without bracing for bad news. People asked whether I confronted Stephanie with the credit card statements and the texts as a form of justice. I told them I had, not as vengeance, but as making a fact plain. She crumpled when she faced it, but the way a person crumples is less interesting than what they do next. She eventually sought therapy, and in small, halting ways, began to repair things in her life. Marcus took up different work and apologized in ways that showed he meant it. People change slowly and by degrees. Death accelerates some changes and reveals others. There is a quiet moral at the end of this. I was not saved by malice, but by foresight. David's prudence was my shield. If there is a lesson you might take away, perhaps it is that love can be rewired into plans. We have a cultural idea that love is warm and spontaneous, full of declarations and fireworks. Sometimes love is a document in a bank that looks dull until you need it. Sometimes love is a line of numbers on a statement that, when read months later, has the power to steady a life. I keep David's letter in a small wooden box on the shelf. I read it on certain mornings when the ache feels heavy, and each time his handwriting folds together my memory like a soft map. I do not speak of Stephanie often. The story is not about her downfall. It is about a son's intention and a mother's right to be secure without shame. If, listening to this, you remember a time when someone tried to make you invisible, I want you to hold this. Dignity is not only a state of being, but sometimes an act you must take. Sometimes it requires you to speak softly and present the evidence of your life. Sometimes it requires you to accept a gift that looks practical, because practical things are how people survive. Thank you for listening to this story. If it reached you in some small way, please share in the comments if you've had a moment where someone's quiet planning kept you safe, or if you've been pushed to the margins and found a way back. Subscribe if you want to hear more stories like this. I'm grateful to have you here, and I read every comment that comes in.